to Off the Record News. I'm your host, Diana Longry. Thank you for tuning in. Off the Record News is brought to you from the SCC studios out of White Bear Lake. And through a cooperative agreement, this program is also simultaneously broadcast to those studios out of the Roseville viewing area, the CTV studios. As a result of this cooperative effort, this program reaches out to and serves approximately 28 communities in the Northeast metropolitan area. Now today is March 20th, 2013, and I'm very pleased to have a guest with me, two guests actually with me, who are here to talk about the Patriot Act. Is it criminalizing free speech? Well, certainly it seems it is. So with that, I want to welcome my two guests with me this evening. I have Susan Linda Dower and also Wayne Whitman. So thank you very much, the two of you, for being here on the program. It's a great honor to have you here. And normally what I do is I have my guests give a short introduction of themselves for the viewers, because who best to know what to pick and choose of your background than yourself? So, Wayne, we'll start with you first.
Okay. First, I want to thank the station for showing this program. I want to thank Susan from leaving Washington, D.C., where it's probably snowing, and coming to Minnesota, where it is snowing and cold. And as a member of the community, I want to welcome you to Minnesota and welcome you to share with us your experiences and giving us the opportunity to know what you experienced and to learn from you, because we need to know, we need to be able to say what we see and say what we know and be able to freely express our views without feeling any fear at all. I'm a community person. I've been living in St. Paul since 1958. I was an early opponent to the war in Vietnam. I noted in 1967, when I was written up in the paper as a veteran for peace, at that time, that there were 5% of our population who were opposing the war. And at that time, you felt I felt some shunning, and you felt some people thought you were a traitor, some people thought you were not being patriotic, not supporting our government. But I felt at that time that I was free. I'd served in the military. I was a citizen of the United States of America, and I could freely say what I thought and be critical of my government. At that time, I did at that time, but since the Patriot Act, I have been feeling more and more that sense of freedom that I experienced is being eroded. I lost part of my patriotism, part of my heritage by this Patriot Act, and I'm so glad that you're here to give us your experiences with that act, because what we do with our laws impact on people. And when it does that, we need to highlight that and say, maybe we've gone too far. Maybe we should change.
That's right, Wayne. And I think that you brought up some very good points, that you felt that before the Patriot Act that you had the ability to speak out, that if you wanted to criticize what was going on in your government, the decisions that they were making, you felt like you would be able to do that.
And I did it.
Yes, exactly.
I'm not sure I'm going to be able to continue to do it.
Yeah,
that's my concern.
Exactly, and I think why it is so wonderful that we have Susan here is because she's not going to just talk about it from the theoretical point of view. Susan's going to talk about it from the upfront, close, personal view, because you have experienced it firsthand. I think you were telling me before we sat up here on the stage that you were actually the first or the second non-Arab person who was incarcerated under the Patriot Act for speaking up for free speech. And so I'm going to give you the floor to tell our viewers a little bit, first of all, about your background.
I'll cut to the chase of who I was and what I did. We're here today on the anniversary of the 10-year anniversary of the Iraqi War, the start of the Iraqi War. And that's very important because I was the chief asset for the CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency covering Iraq at the United Nations for about 7 years prior to the war. And I had privileged access to, I was a covert back channel dealing with the ambassador to Iraq, from Iraq to the United Nations, and senior diplomats.
So in other words, what you're saying, so that our viewers get an inside view, is that you were a journalist.
No.
And then they were using.
No.
Okay.
No. I was an asset.
Okay.
I was a back channel asset.
Right. And explain to our viewers what that means, because for most of them, you know, all they know about all this stuff is what they see on, you know, 007. I mean,
well,
what does it mean to be an asset?
I was chosen because I was anti-war and anti-sanctions, and I was given an opportunity to participate on the inside to try to. It was a challenge that was made to me that if I wanted to really make a difference, I could go to the Iraqis, and here was the amazing thing. It was covert on the U.S. side. In other words, the Western media, CNN, had no idea who I was. They were never allowed to know that this was actually happening. But the Iraqi diplomats were fully informed from the get-go. And I also covered Libya at the United Nations. And I was doing back-channel work on terrorism specifically. And Gaddafi at the time had been accused of the Lockerbie trial, and Saddam Hussein was one of our best sources on terrorism intelligence throughout the 1990s. And so what happened was, building up to the war in Iraq, there was a peace option. And the whole history of pre-war intelligence that you have been told, every single word of it was a lie. There's not a single thing that you were told, that the people were told, that was actually true.
And you're talking about a peace option. So many people would have loved to have known that there was a peace option.
Yeah, let me tell you what it was about. If you wonder if someone like Wayne Whitman ever makes a difference, let me tell you it does make a difference. The reason that there was a peace option, 2 German pilots had decided they were going to run the blockade on Baghdad, and they were flying humanitarian supplies, medical equipment, doctors, nurses, pharmaceuticals into Baghdad International Airport. When the CIA saw this, they knew that the sanctions were going to fall. Sanctions had already killed 1.7 million human beings, including 1 million children under the age of 5. All these statistics you hear are so underinflated. They are cut to protect to try to reassure you that there's not really a problem. Literacy was wiped out in a generation. Baghdad went from having the best hospitals in the Middle East and performing the 2nd heart transplant in the world to having the worst quality medical care and a policy of genocide. And that's why I got involved. But when the CIA, so I started my contact with the Iraqis in 1996, and I started my contact with Libya in 1995. And everything I did was overseen and reported to the U.S. government. But I have to emphasize, both of those governments knew what I was doing. Libya and Iraq were fully informed. They chose to participate. They chose dialogue. And when you see Iran as a conflict and you think to yourself, nothing can be done, that is absolutely wrong. And I very quickly want to enumerate what was on the Iraqi peace option.
Yeah.
1, weapons inspections with no conditions. Iraq agreed from the end of the Clinton administration to invite the weapons inspectors back into Baghdad. And this was completely suppressed from the people. They knew, that everyone knew, the writing was on the wall that the sanctions were going to fall. And the CIA rushed in and said, okay, what will you give us if we're willing to give up the sanctions? Because they wanted to make sure the United States would dominate the agenda. And I was told that if I wanted to negotiate this in my back channel capacity, I must never question what the United States wanted. I must just say yes and go get it. Okay? And so we had weapons inspections, cooperation with anti-terrorism. 6 months before 9/11 happened, in February of 2001, Baghdad agreed to a CIA demand that the FBI must be allowed to send a task force into Iraq with authorization to conduct terrorism investigations, interview witnesses, and make arrests.
The FBI?
Yes, and Iraq agreed.
Wow.
Iraq agreed to this. After 9/11, Iraq tried to give financial documents to Washington through my back channel that would have pinpointed the financial hiding places that Al-Qaeda was using. Washington didn't want the financial pipeline shut down. Now, isn't that interesting? Because it actually comes from heroin trafficking. So if you were serious about the war on terrorism, you could have shut down 2 things at once. And none of this was done.
And you hear so much in the news about the war on crime, or the drugs, rather, and this sounds to me like this would have been a very win-win situation to be able to work on the peace option, plus really shut down a pipeline to drugs.
Absolutely.
But it also shuts down jobs, too, doesn't it?
Well,
of bureaucrats.
It shows that the CIA is fully aware of the workings of the heroin trade, and a lot of the 85% of the heroin is coming out of Afghanistan. We know that American soldiers are posted to guard the poppy fields. Okay, so let me go on, because there's even more that we were going to get. The United States was promised preferential contracts in healthcare, pharmaceuticals, hospital equipment to rebuild the healthcare sector. They were promised preferential contracts in transportation. Iraq offered to purchase think of the labor market now, and the need for jobs and the bailout that we had to invest in. Iraq offered to buy 1 million American manufactured automobiles every year for 10 years.
Wow.
Would have been pretty cool for labor, wouldn't it? Yeah, Iraq also promised to give the United States preferential oil contracts to rebuild the oil pipelines, the oil pumping stations. That would be U.S. equipment purchases, and to give the United States preferential contracts in oil development of the fields.
Right, and I know that that's a very big thing, because many of those kinds of contracts in other countries, like Libya, for instance, you know, they put them up on the chopping block for the highest bidder.
Sure.
And so, for instance, like an oil company like Occidental Oil out of California, you know, that was one thing they wanted to make sure that in Libya that they scored was that preferential oil contract, because that is a huge score. So in order to have that as being part of a peace agreement, that would eliminate having a war over oil.
You would have never have needed a war for oil. And so you don't have a war for terrorism, you don't need a war for oil, you don't need a war for weapons of mass destruction. What about democracy? Well, imagine if you had known that a year before the invasion, 12 months before the invasion, Saddam Hussein made a covert offering to the West, and they did it through my back channel, and I will swear to this, that he would be willing to retire to a villa close to Tikrit, where he was from, and all he asked for was a contingent of Republican guards to guard his villa. He compared it to the Secret Service guarding the former President of the United States, Bill Clinton. And he said, I'll retire and you can have free elections in 18 months.
Wow.
And the Iraqi exiles who have been hiding in Detroit or in Minnesota or in London or in Washington, they can all come back immediately, and they can be housed in expanded embassy compounds. Embassy compounds are sovereign territory of their home country, and they can be housed in embassy compounds protected by embassy security. They can be taken around the country to hold campaign events, to start campaign media, open opposition headquarters, and they can begin That's a safe way for them to be repatriated without any discord to the country.
Right.
Now think about that. They would be protected because what the Iraqis pointed out was that if Saddam's government were to attack or kidnap or threaten or harass an inhabitant of that embassy compound, that would be considered a declaration of war against that home country. And so they were like, this is a very good solution. They can come back and Saddam, he probably won't be around. And so when this started to come out, they said that, maybe Saddam wanted $1 billion. The West tried to say that Saddam wanted $1 billion to retire. It was an outright lie. He did not. He wanted a small contingent of Republican Guard, just like he compared it to the Secret Service guarding President Bill Clinton.
And when you start thinking about all the, then later, the costs of war, and even if that $1 billion had even actually been accurate, think about that in the long run, considering all the billions and billions and billions that in the end were wasted and lives lost and resources and just harm to, well, actually, I think harm to national security as well.
The devastation to the Iraqi people.
Yes.
The devastation to the Iraqi people. And the reason, I'm telling you all of this now, and people say, in Washington, this is a very inconvenient conversation. They really don't want you to know the choices that were available to the government. And the reason I'd like to talk now to tie this back to the Patriot Act and to Bradley Manning, because the reason that nobody knows these facts is when a year after the war started, President Bush announced that he was appointing a presidential commission on Iraqi pre-war intelligence, and I petitioned to be one of the witnesses.
Ah, okay.
I went and I did not do what Bradley Manning did, unfortunately. We need to come back and talk about Bradley Manning. This is very important what he suffered. But I went through proper channels, and I requested to testify, and 30 days after I made my request, the FBI, I woke up one morning to hear the FBI pounding on my door with an arrest warrant on the Patriot Act.
Ah.
And I became the second non-Arab American ever indicted on the Patriot Act.
So your response to signing up to come to testify on the intelligence that had gone on before the war was to have the government at your doorstep with a warrant.
Yes.
So we don't
accusing me of being an Iraqi agent because I was not a patriot who supported the war. If I was a real American agent, I would lie for the government.
Yes. And you wouldn't question the war in the least bit.
That's right. I would be helping them cover it up.
So in other words, they were concerned about what you would testify to if you indeed were there to testify. And that maybe if you weren't allowed to testify, you would find other channels in order to tell folks what it was that you had to talk about.
And in addition to this, adding to the embarrassment for the government, my cousin, and I apologize to the world for this, I apologize to all the American people. My cousin, Andrew Card, was the chief of staff to George Bush. Monster that he was, a man I despise. I despise George Bush. Absolutely coward, weak, stupid, very selfish man. But there were 11 debriefings that I gave to the White House, and unfortunately, that I gave to the White House during from the end of the Clinton administration all the way up to the war, the start of the war. And those papers would have been released to the public if I had been allowed to if I had prevailed in my demand to testify. But as you also say, even if I had not prevailed in my demand to testify, my proper requests through proper channels, there would have been new outlets for me to do that. And so that's why they decided they had to shut me up.
Mm-hmm. And so then they showed up at your doorstep with a warrant. What happened next?
I was under indictment on the Patriot Act for 5 years. During this whole time, I was prohibited from having any hearing of any kind whatsoever. I was never allowed to have a trial, and adding to the horror of it, I was subjected to, first of all, let me tell you what the Patriot Act is. I was subjected to secret charges, secret evidence, and secret grand jury testimony. We were never allowed to see one single FBI interview. Well, usually when the FBI interviews a witness, they're required to turn that over to the defense. In my case, all of that every single document was off limits.
So all of the due process procedures that we have afforded to us as Americans under the Constitution is basically swept under the carpet when it comes to the Patriot Act, because those safeguards for due process are gone. You don't even know who your accuser is, correct?
Yes, yes.
You don't know what it is you're accused of.
That's right. You're not allowed, exactly, you're not allowed to know who has accused you of what crime. The government is under no obligation to provide any evidence that a crime actually occurred. And, this is really onerous, if you have an alibi, like I was an asset, and I was able to prove that. It was very easy for me to prove that. I had papers from the Justice Department declaring that my CIA handler was a man of extreme intelligence importance, and that he was off limits, that he was entitled as a witness in any case, in any criminal or civil case, he was entitled to special handling from the court. And all we had to do was take that in front of the judge or present it to a jury and just say, here's what the Justice Department said about my CIA handler. And everyone would have said, oh yes, okay, we got it. It was very easy. The Justice Department themselves had declared it. And so establishing my credentials would have been very, very simple. Also, my CIA handler had testified on Capitol Hill publicly in congressional testimony about a U.S. corporation that supplied Scud mobile missile launchers to the Iraqi government. So it was very easy to establish this. But coming to the Patriot Act, the reason that none of this was ever known was that the government has now declared that free speech, we think of the Patriot Act as applying to terrorism, but it doesn't. It applies to free speech and sedition.
That's right. And you know, so oftentimes when you talk to people about the Patriot Act, they say out of innocence, I don't have anything to hide. I'm not doing anything illegal. I have nothing to worry about. Who cares about me? Except the point is that any particular time you could be the target simply because you have started to speak about something that is not on the okay to talk list.
Yeah.
And I think that it's important for people to realize that regular United States citizens can be subject to the Patriot Act. And you were saying before the program how much money the United States government spends on enforcing the Patriot Act here within our borders.
We are now spending $75 billion a year on domestic surveillance. Pretty much in a 10-mile radius, they can get every home, every computer, every phone line. They can tap it, listen to it, check it.
And so with all this talk on Capitol Hill about the sequestration and the horrors of sequestration, you would think that with that much money involved in surveillance, somebody might bring up sequestration versus surveillance. Let's do a balance here. Maybe we need to cut back on the surveillance a little bit, because mostly Americans are law-abiding citizens now, aren't they?
Yes.
Why are we worried about who they're assembling with? Why are we worried
I was
about
always
what
a
they have to
law-abiding
say?
citizen. I was like, how dare you come and say that how dare you, this has to be a joke. When they first arrested me, I was like, you're kidding. You obviously don't know who I am. How can you be so ridiculous? How can you make these ridiculous statements? But you see, I had come out passionately against the Iraqi war. I was a passionately outspoken advocate against this war. And what you find is that under the Patriot Act, free speech and sedition are pretty much equivalent to each other now. And I want Wayne to jump in here because...
Yeah. Well, many times what you say, I question, well, is this true? Can this be true? Can this be true? Can this be true? But that's not my issue. My issue is that you get a chance to say what you experience.
Oh, all of it is documented. All of this is documented.
Right, but what Wayne is saying is that having the ability to be able to say what you want to say, that is the crux of this whole matter. I mean, it's also a huge issue, the information you know, but the fact of being able to express what you know.
I've been to Colombia as a guest of the beverage workers in Bogota. Okay, they invited us there. I was there with a delegation from Witness for Peace and Veterans for Peace, and also been there with the School of the Americas Watch. And I met with people who have met with the FARC, so the communications are there. I come home in August, a couple of years ago, and September 26th of the same year, people were being arrested and they are under indictment for being suspected of being supporters of the people who I just met with. So, I can't easily be waking up at my front door. I mean, a little hard now, but
you could be next.
I could be next. And, and I'm doing something that I've always been encouraged by my community, by my education, by my church, by other people to, hey, get involved, know what's going on, find out. Don't be just accepting everything, question things. And so that's my life.
Right, and yet so
now,
oftentimes
you support peace. You're not supporting violent activities. You are, that's a very important.
That is a part of my life.
Yes,
it is to counter the waste and the terrible things that happen as a result of war. And looking at Iraq, I never thought my government would consciously, illegally, immorally violate the United Nations and all of our treaties and invade another country after seeking approval from the United Nations and being rebuffed. They said, to hell with the country, to hell with what you think, we're going to just do it.
Yes.
And that was my issue when we invaded Iraq. And had I known what you were talking about, that would just add to all of the...
Exactly, and that ties in with something that we talked about before the program, is the importance of citizens being able to communicate with each other and to be able to find each other so that they can organize, so that they can communicate. And yet we find so often, whether or not it's the Patriot Act, which tries to isolate individuals from each other, or whether or not if it's something like what's going on in Minnesota here with trying to change our Data Practices Act to say that emails that are collected by the government for government use are somehow private and confidential data, when your email address is no different than your street address, because other citizens would be able to find out who submitted a petition with emails so that they could contact them and say, I want to talk about this issue in my community. See, so there's so many ways that, whether or not it's the Patriot Act or other ways, that the government is taking these actions to try to keep people quiet, keep them separate, keep them in their place.
Yes.
And, and I think that our viewers have to know that, sure, you were under 5 years of indictment without having hearings or trials or whatever, but you were also put on a military base, and you were basically imprisoned for a year, wasn't it?
Yes, I was imprisoned on Carswell Air Force Base in Texas. And what happened was the Democrats, two things happened. The Democrats announced they were going to hold their own investigation into pre-war intelligence and to find out if the Bush administration was suppressing intelligence from the people. And Colin Powell, General Colin Powell, former Secretary of State and head of the Joint Chiefs, decided that he was going to launch a book tour to clean up his reputation.
Oh.
And yes, and to pretend that no one mid-level from the CIA had come to him prior to his big speech at the United Nations. Well, it just so happened I had, because he lived next door to my CIA handler, and I took him copies of the Iraqi peace option. And I said, and I gave him a debriefing, I gave him a paper debriefing that the peace option was still valid and could be achieved, that the Iraqis were still committed to the principles of democracy, and that there would be no reason that if what he stated was his goal, then he could achieve everything he wanted without firing a shot. And by the way, the Iraqi exiles were huge liars, and it was extremely doubtful that there were any weapons of mass destruction, given that Iraq had tried for 2 years prior to the war to get the weapons inspectors into Iraq. So they'd been trying from the end of the Clinton administration, and it was the U.S. side that was refusing to send the weapons inspectors, not the Iraqis. So when Colin Powell decided he wanted to rehabilitate his reputation, I was in the way. And so literally he made a big announcement on Barbara Walters 2020, condemning on September 8th. And on September 17th, the Justice Department rubber-stamped an order that I was, quote, incompetent to stand trial. And on September 23rd, I was ordered into court, and I was told that I would be surrendering to prison on Carswell Air Force Base with no hearing. Wow. And that I would have to serve my time in prison, and after I was released, after my release from prison, I could then petition the court for a hearing. Otherwise, if I tried to have a hearing if I demanded a hearing before my prison sentence, they would revoke my bail, and I would forfeit my bail immediately and throughout the end of the proceedings.
Oh my goodness!
Which could continue indefinitely. We didn't even know, and so I had no choice except to surrender and say, well, after I serve my prison sentence, then we'll have a hearing and talk about it.
You know, and that is just so backwards.
And then once I got into prison, they decided they were not going to release me, and they petitioned the court to detain me indefinitely, up to 10 years, with no right to a hearing, in case maybe I was telling the truth. And they asked for permission to forcibly drug me with Haldol, Ativan, and Prozac, so that I could be cured of believing that I was an asset, and I could be stopped, chemically lobotomized, so I would be incapable of talking. Now, this is actually very serious, because Carswell Prison is where all women political prisoners are now being taken across the country. Plowshare activists are being taken there. Tax protesters. I don't mean like, you know, the businesses who don't pay their taxes. Some of those people end up at Carswell. But tax protesters are ending up there. Lynn Stewart, a famous attorney, is there. And what they do is they put you onto a military base where it's a corporate-run prison, but it's on a military base, so no media can enter the base. And therefore, you become isolated, and there's no way for you to get your story out. There's no one who can petition to come in and interview you to expose how the abuse you're suffering, the mistreatment.
It's like being incarcerated in a foreign country with a closed border.
Yes.
And so nobody can get in, nobody can get out, and there's no way to communicate. And I think even in all of our prison system that we have in the United States, means if somebody's incarcerated, I mean, that's part of, you know, the process. If they are there, they have, first of all, they had due process. They went through a hearing. They went through a trial. They are there, they have their sentence, but they can have family come visit them, they can have other people come visit them. I mean, there's a system, and that's what is looked at as being humane.
Yes.
And what you're describing it really is isolation, and it doesn't sound very humane at all.
Well, and you talk about like visits from family and attorneys. My uncle, now I have to tell you, I had a public defender. I did not have a private attorney at this stage. I was just too poor. I couldn't afford a six-figure defense. $100,000, $200,000 defense was out of my reach. It was impossible for me to do that. And that's the other thing, is these cases, these ridiculous cases, are huge money eaters. They're terribly expensive. But my uncle was an attorney with 40 years in the law from the University of Chicago. And he jumped on my case. He tried to visit me at Carswell. The military, even though he was family and an attorney, the military refused to let him enter the base to see me. First, they told my uncle that there was no prison located on Carswell Air Force Base, and that I was definitely not an inmate there. And my uncle said, well, I have letters from Susan, and I have the order from the judge that she has to surrender here. I know you're wrong. I've spoken to her from this prison. And the military said, oh, no, you're mistaken. Go away. Don't come back. My uncle did come back. The next time they said, yeah, there's a prison here, but she's not an inmate here. And so my uncle literally had to go back to the judge and have U.S. Marshals threatening to standing by, threatening to force their way onto the base. So he literally had to go 3 times to the base, and had to have U.S. Marshals standing behind him, flanking him at the entrance, at the gate, ready to force their way onto the prison before I was finally allowed to have an attorney visit. And meanwhile, I was being threatened with 10 years of indefinite detention and no right to even a hearing in the case. So this was like crazy stuff that you can't imagine. But when you paint somebody as an Iraqi agent, and there I was locked up on a Texas military base as an accused Iraqi agent.
And a little nuts.
Oh, I was becoming very frightened nuts. I mean, as I've said before in my book, I was scared like a scalded cat. I mean, I've met terrorists. I have met terrorists. I've met real terrorists who did not scare me as much as these prison psychiatrists who were willing to lie and falsify testimony to help out the government. And this brings us to Bradley Manning.
Yes.
And
I'm so pleased to hear your support of Bradley Manning.
Strong supporter. I love Bradley Manning.
Veterans for Peace has been championing his cause ever since he blew the whistle and let us know what he saw, and let the world know what he saw. And we need more of that. We need more of your testimony, whether we can agree with it or not, whether it's false or not. We need to hear it. And we need to hear Bradley Manning did such a good job.
Well, you need to be able to have a process that supports whistleblowers. That's what you need to have. Because if you want to continue to have a democracy, you have to be able to allow your citizens to ask for accountability, to ask, well, what's the information? What's going on? You have all this talk about transparency, but if you don't actually do anything to preserve transparency, to preserve accountability, and to allow people to become whistleblowers, you will not have democracy in the long run whatsoever. That's my opinion about it. And you know, you mentioned something about how when you were on the on the base there, that even the media couldn't come on the base to even get your story out. Well, I guess my feeling is that here we have Bradley Manning. He's going through his trial, and there is no mainstream media there covering this very serious trial. because it is a trial about a whistleblower, and the media should be there. They should have a correspondent from every major news source, but they don't. Instead, we have volunteer citizens who are the reporters, who are letting people know what's going on. And so I think it's an atrocity that our mainstream media, that they are not focusing on this. Instead, they're siding with the government. They're supposed to be one of the watchdogs to help us citizens watch the government. Instead, they want to help the government and say, oh, they're doing just fine, don't bug them.
Yeah, and I would just like to say, you know, I described the peace option to you, and I would like to add that that my statements are supported by, because of the Patriot Act, they were wiretapping all my phone calls. We had 28,000 phone calls, 8,000 emails, hundreds of captured faxes. So all of this is documented in what we call real time. So we could prove that all of it was true. We could prove the conversations took place with the ambassadors and the diplomats and all this stuff. We could prove
They got big shredders.
Well, no. We had it.
Oh, okay.
We had it.
Oh, okay.
That was the amazing thing, is that we did have it.
Well,
we
that's
could
good.
prove it.
That's good.
We could absolutely prove everything. But what happened was, that's why they defamed my reputation. But imagine, for all of you out there who think you don't like WikiLeaks, or you think you don't like Julian Assange, I would just like you to think of it from a different perspective. Like you say, oh, he's a traitor. He can't be a traitor. He's not representing the United States government. He is a journalist. He has no obligation to protect the United States whatsoever. He's a foreigner. He has every right to expose what we do. Is Bradley Manning a traitor? Think about this. The CIA is a cult. It is a cult of secrecy and paranoia. And it is indoctrinated to be paranoid and fearful of any sort of communications and disclosure. I personally, before the war, did not have the skills to come and tell you what I knew. I needed a Julian Assange and a WikiLeaks to help me do that, to help me negotiate this treachery of sunshine. Oh my goodness, sunshine. You know, I didn't know how to do it. I had no idea. And imagine what you would have, what the whole world, if you had known about this peace option, and if you had seen any of the Andy Card letters, there were 11 debriefings, and if you had known that this was a possibility from the get-go, imagine what pain we could have avoided.
Oh yes, absolutely. And think about, you know, I can't help but think about, you know, Congress in all of this, because in the end, technically, Congress is the body that's supposed to declare war.
Yes.
And yet it doesn't seem like that's the way the process works anymore. And that the president just declares, aha, we're going to declare war, and we're going to go in there and we're going to do
well, in this case, they did have a war authorization vote on Iraq. The problem was that they based it on fraud, and lies,
and they didn't have the proper information.
They didn't have, well, and they pretended they didn't have the proper information. One of the things that comes out in my case was that they did know, and they did deliberately deceive the public. Now, this becomes very important under the Patriot Act, because the Patriot Act exists to protect politicians who are afraid of facing the people, and they're afraid of losing the election. And they're right. It is like you're giving Congress the, quote, right, the guaranteed right to be reelected. And you're saying that anyone who threatens the president or congressional continuity is a traitor, a criminal act, that exposing information to the public that will help them make better decisions and choices becomes a criminal action, because somebody might lose their job. They might not get reelected.
And I think there's probably a lot of powerful people with a lot of money at stake in all of this, because there's money to be made with having war. There's money to be made in letting the drugs flow over the border. There's money to be made in all of these things, and that's part of the hierarchy of the power structure. And of course, knowing that there's a peace option, that would bring the whole house of cards to a stop.
Unfortunately, it takes sometimes 150 years. We just in Minnesota now are finding out what happened to the Dakota people during the 1862 war, and now it's coming out that we did a lot of we didn't treat those people very well. And the year 2013 is the year when we can accept that. Now we have John F. Kennedy's assassination. A lot of people are asking a lot of questions about that. We had the Tonkin Bay situation. We did find out that we do now acknowledge that that was a fabrication. We also note now that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So why can't we be asking those questions a lot earlier?
Yes.
And the reason we don't do it is because people are afraid to come forward and tell what they did. We also know in Vietnam you kill anything that moves. What we did there was unconscionable, and yet we are now just starting to be able to face some of those realities. Some of them have come home and said it before, but so many people who live with those realities don't continue to live. They've taken their lives.
Yes,
and particularly now with Iraq and Afghanistan, so much horror occurs because of what we've done.
I've been told that one veteran attempts suicide every 80 minutes.
Probably.
Wow, and that's a staggering statistic.
Yes.
Now, Susan, you are going to be appearing tomorrow at an event in Minnetonka. Tell us a little bit about that event, because I know that our program is starting to run down, and people are going to say, well, I want to hear more. So how can they hear more?
Well, they can buy my book, Extreme Prejudice, which is available on Amazon and Kindle. And I'm going to be speaking at...
This event is going to be on Thursday, March 21st at 6:30. And Minnetonka, there's the address. So we'll leave it up there for a little bit so our viewers can get out their pencil and their paper and write down the address. And so now, Susan, what are you going to be talking about tomorrow?
Well, we're going to be talking about more details about the Patriot Act, 9/11. And 9/11, it happened 10 years ago, but it is still relevant to, it changed our world. And we're going to be talking about the whole national security state that has evolved, which is taking away our freedoms, and the whole Iraq conflict and more of these same issues.
And I found it fascinating. You were telling me about a stop you had made at William Mitchell Law School, where you were talking to a bunch of the law students there, and they found this all very fascinating about your story and about you know, how this interacted with their class and their studies.
Yes,
and
I had a wonderful time. I had a wonderful response from the students. It was very exciting to see that they are so there's now law students today are on the front lines.
That's right.
In this brave new world, and they're going to have to juxtapose or juxtapose. They're going to have to balance. It's going to be a tightrope act. What the government perceives as necessary for its own national security, some of which may be valid, you know, but the problem is that defendants like me are being hit with secret charges, secret evidence, secret grand jury testimony. In my case, there was a non-disclosure agreement that I was not even allowed to know that my attorney had received a debriefing from the Justice Department.
Wow. And
because my attorney was forced to sign a document saying that he would never disclose anything to me, the defendant, or any other counsel without the written consent of the prosecution.
And this is why I think,
that's the Patriot Act.
In your point that it's important for up-and-coming law students to be aware of this, because you mentioned something earlier, that you didn't have a private attorney, you had a public defender.
Yes.
And you see, there's going to be many people that if they find themselves in the same position as you, they're not going to have the money to properly defend themselves. And the public defenders are going to have to be aware of this area of law.
Yes.
Because they may find that as time goes on, that they are going to have more and more people who are going to need a public defender who's got some experience or at least knowledge of what the Patriot Act is.
Who is struggling
Yes.
with national security.
Yes.
And the problem is that national security is being applied to everything now.
Yes.
Because if it's Occupy Wall Street, now some of you like Occupy Wall Street, some of you don't, but the bottom line is these are people who are practicing freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm.
They're out there standing up for what they believe in, and they're trying to call attention to the issues they love, and they're trying to take a stand. Well, the government has declared that mass protests are subject to special criminal prosecutions now, and those people can be detained under the Patriot Act without charge, without indictments. They can be subjected to heavy surveillance. When I was under the Patriot Act, the state of Maryland state troopers ran heavy surveillance investigations on Amnesty International, the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, which supports green energy, solar and wind power, because they might threaten the status quo of the energy community. They went after death penalty activists who are opposed to killing people. It is a very scary thing.
They might start coming after public access TV programming after a while. You know how many times we've had the Occupy Wall Street people on this program? Oh,
I love Occupy.
Oh,
I love
goodness.
them. I love them.
So
they're great.
Yes, and once again, tell us about your book, and we'll put up the information on your book again.
Okay, it is Extreme Prejudice, the terrifying story of the Patriot Act and the cover-ups of 9/11 in Iraq. And it is all the intelligence that you have never been told, that you were lied about, that the government lied to you about. And it is a personal story. It's not an academic book. It's not for scholars and foreign policy gurus. It's for regular people to understand what's happening.
Yes, and I think it is very important that regular people understand what's happening. And I do want to mention that the organizations that all came together to bring you to Minnesota, I think they need a shout out here.
Yes,
and that's the St. Paul Regional Labor Federation, St. Luke's Presbyterian Church, Veterans for Peace, Minnesota Peace Action Coalition, Minnesota Truth, endorsed by Women Against Military Madness, and Minnesota Alliance of Peacemakers.
Thank you to all of those guys.
Yes, very much.
I'm so impressed by Minnesota.
My goal is to bring you back.
I'd love to come back.
Excellent.
I'd love
well,
to come
I want
back.
to thank both of you for coming on the program today, and we're going to end up with a video from Costs of War. It's from costsofwar.org, and it comes from the Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. I think it really sums up the costs of war. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
This is the beginning, but not the end, of our effort to wind down this war.
The long summer of 2011 is really a significant moment. 10th anniversary of 9/11, coming on 10 years in Afghanistan, approaching what may be an end to U.S. military involvement in Iraq, and the beginning of a drawdown in Afghanistan. What it all cost.
After 10 years of war, it really is imperative that we understand how much the American people and the people of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan have been paying for these wars, and the cost is staggering. Their present costs, their future costs, their human costs and their financial costs, their social costs.
We have borrowed virtually all of the money that has been used to pay for the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. And that has been very expensive, adding at least $1.5 trillion to our national debt.
Millions of people have been displaced, and many more have suffered and died because of lack of access to clean drinking water, because they're malnourished, because they can't get to health care facilities.
There's a major war going on in Pakistan. There have been tens of thousands of people killed and several million refugees created.
In Afghanistan, at least 12,000 to 14,000 civilians have died. In Iraq, at least 125,000 civilians have been killed. And in Pakistan, about 35,000 people have died.
Taking care of our veterans over the next 20, 30, 40 years. That cost alone will add another $600 billion to $1 trillion.
Many of the costs of the war are undercounted, they're uncounted, in some cases even suppressed, and it makes it imperative that we try and put this together to get a full sense of what the war has cost us. A lot of Americans know that 6,000 of our young men and women have died in uniform in the war, but very few people know that the scale of human death and wounding has been much vaster, both in the military and in the civilian sectors, and that the costs have been borne unevenly. The military families, contractor families, the people of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, of course, have borne a tremendous cost.
It's hard to convey the cost in lives over there because of these wars, and the psychological toll and the physical toll for the survivors who've lost limbs, who have been stunted by malnourishment, and have suffered diseases they would otherwise not have gotten. So it's very tough to talk about it, but we have to.
When the battles have been fought, what kinds of destruction is left behind, what refugee flows, what destruction of housing, what kinds of new family structures get set up when women are widowed, and what kinds of challenges, poverty, often ensue for families. And to take responsibility for that, to say this is what that choice to go to war resulted in. It resulted in these costs.
So the overall cost of taking 2 million young people and bringing them into the line of fire in conflicts which have had really no front lines, so they've had a very, very large number of injuries relative to fatalities. The cost of this is borne by many, many different groups in our society.
Wars, in a sense, are never over when they're over. They go on for decades, and some of the peak costs for this war will be incurred 40 years from now as veterans age into some of the most difficult years for dealing with their disability and injuries from the war.
At this point, I think the questions that we should be asking are, if not for the decision to invade Iraq in particular, would we still be mired in Afghanistan? Would oil prices be where they are? Would the national debt be as high as it is? Would the financial crisis have been as severe as it was? And I think arguably the answer to all four of those questions is no.
One of the things that we have to understand is what the trade-offs were. What kinds of job creation, what kinds of improvements in our infrastructure, and what kind of greening of the American economy could have occurred with all of the funds and all of the human labor that have instead gone into waging the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan.
There is an immense and urgent requirement to learn from the experience of the past decade and to try to ensure that we don't make the same mistakes all over again.
So we're at a decision point, I think, in 2011. We're at the point when we can decide to draw down more quickly or draw down more slowly in Afghanistan. We can decide whether or not to keep funding the Pakistani military and Frontier Corps. We can decide how we want to structure repayment of the borrowing for these wars. But there are a lot of choices that we could make right now that will either increase or decrease the human and the financial costs of the conflicts that we began after 9/11.
Are you concerned about peace, justice, and jobs? So am I. I'm Diana Longry, and I invite you to join me, Washington at Work.